The city knew him as the Ghost, a man who could end lives with a single gesture, who built an empire on fear and absolute control. But there was one secret Antonio Marchetti guarded more fiercely than any business deal or betrayal. He was completely deaf. No voices, no music, no warnings. Just silence. For 42 years, he had lived in a soundless world, reading lips with deadly accuracy, feeling vibrations through marble floors, understanding the language of fear written on faces better than most people understood words. His enemies thought his quietness was calculated intimidation. They had no idea the truth was far more personal. That Wednesday morning, Antonio sat in his corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, reviewing reports from his various enterprises. The numbers told their usual story: the construction contracts laundering money efficiently, the shipping operations moving product without customs interference, the casino revenues flowing into offshore accounts like a golden river. Everything under control, as it had been for decades. Then Isabella Santos walked into his life. She wasn't supposed to be there. The regular cleaning service had sent her as a last-minute replacement. No background check, no proper vetting, just a woman who arrived at 7:30 with cleaning supplies and a quiet determination that immediately set her apart from the nervous staff who usually tiptoed through his domain. Antonio noticed her the moment she entered his office. Not because she was beautiful, though she carried herself with an elegance that demanded attention. Not because she seemed nervous, though he detected the slight tension in her shoulders. He noticed her because she looked at him differently, not with fear, but with something that made his chest tighten. Recognition. Understanding. Pity. She moved through the room with practiced efficiency, dusting shelves lined with leather-bound books he'd never read, straightening crystal decanters containing whiskey older than most of his enemies. Antonio watched from his peripheral vision, noting how she handled each item with appropriate care, maintaining the respectful distance he required. But then she froze. Her eyes locked onto the side of his head with an intensity that made Antonio's jaw clench. No one stared at him like this. No one dared examine him as if he were a puzzle requiring solution. His hand moved instinctively toward the desk drawer where he kept his weapon. Isabella's expression wasn't threatening, though. It was concerned, almost maternal. She raised her hand slowly, pointing toward his right ear with a trembling finger. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear but somehow felt in the space between them. Then she did something no one had dared do in 42 years. She stepped closer, her hand reaching toward his face with deliberate gentleness. Antonio could have stopped her. Should have stopped her. Every instinct screamed at him to reassert control, to remind this stranger exactly who she was dealing with. But something deeper held him frozen. Something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, not the cold clinical touch of the countless specialists who had examined him throughout his life. This was different, gentle, almost reverent, as if she understood that what she was about to do would change everything. Antonio felt pressure in his ear canal, a sensation so familiar he'd stopped noticing it years ago. Isabella's brow furrowed in concentration, her breathing steady as she worked, reaching for something that had been there for decades, something every expensive doctor had somehow missed. The resistance was immediate. Whatever blocked his hearing had settled deep, becoming part of his anatomy through years of neglect. Isabella paused, meeting his eyes with a look that asked permission to continue. Antonio found himself nodding. The most dangerous man in New York surrendering control to a woman whose name he didn't even know. She adjusted her approach, angling differently, applying gentle but persistent pressure. Antonio felt movement inside his head, a shifting sensation that made his stomach clench with anticipation and terror. What if this changed nothing? What if he remained trapped in silence forever? Then something gave way. A small, dark mass emerged from deep within his ear canal, compacted earwax, years of buildup that had slowly stolen his connection to the world. Isabella held it in her palm, staring at the tiny object that had imprisoned his hearing for 4 decades. Such a small thing to have such devastating consequences. The rush hit him like a physical blow, air moving through passages that had been blocked since childhood. Pressure equalizing in ways his body had forgotten were possible. Antonio's hands flew to his head as sensation flooded his skull, his heart hammering against his ribs as his brain struggled to process completely foreign input. And then he heard it. The sound of his own breathing, ragged, desperate gasps that he had never experienced as anything more than the feeling of air moving through his lungs. Now they had texture, rhythm, presence. The sound filled the room, echoing off walls that seemed surprised to carry noise after holding silence for so long. Antonio's eyes went wide with shock. His mouth opened, but no words came. How could there be words for something this impossible? His breathing grew louder, more frantic, as if he were drowning in sound after a lifetime underwater. But that was only the beginning. The antique clock on his desk had been ticking for years. Antonio had felt its vibrations during long meetings and longer nights of planning. Now that steady tick-tock crashed through his consciousness like thunder, precise, relentless, beautiful. Time itself had found its voice. Isabella took a step backward, her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound made Antonio flinch as if she'd fired a gunshot. Such a simple noise, the contact between leather and stone. But to his newly awakened ears, it rang like cathedral bells announcing a miracle. The city beyond his windows revealed itself in ways he'd never imagined. Car horns in the distance carrying stories of traffic and frustration. Construction equipment rumbling like mechanical beasts several blocks away. The subway running beneath the building, its rhythmic thunder marking the pulse of a city he controlled but never truly heard. An entire urban orchestra had been playing around him his whole life, and he was finally allowed to hear the music. Antonio stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The leather chair creaked as his weight shifted, another sound he'd never experienced. The rustle of his expensive suit fabric as he moved. The soft whisper of paper sliding across his desk as his movement disturbed them. Even his own heartbeat seemed to echo in the newfound acoustic landscape of his awareness. Isabella watched him with tears streaming down her face. She understood what this moment meant, not just the restoration of his hearing, but the resurrection of a part of his humanity that had been buried for decades. Antonio tried to speak, to thank her, to express what words could never capture. But his voice, and used to being heard by its own owner, came out as a broken whisper. The sound of his own vocal cords vibrating, creating words he could finally receive as well as send. It was too much. Too overwhelming. Too impossibly wonderful. He sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the sensory revolution taking place in his head. 42 years of silence had ended in a single moment of gentle intervention. But as the initial shock began to fade, Antonio realized something that chilled him to the bone. If Isabella could see what doctors had missed, if she could fix what experts had declared unfixable, then everything he believed about his condition had been built on lies. The question started immediately. His mind, sharp from decades of calculating every angle, began dissecting what had just happened with surgical precision. How long had that blockage been there? How many medical professionals had examined him without noticing something so obvious? Dr. Richardson had been his personal physician for 18 years, a renowned otolaryngologist who charged premium rates for his expertise. He'd examined Antonio's ears countless times, always concluding that the deafness was congenital, irreversible, something to accept rather than treat. Antonio remembered sitting in that sterile office as a teenager while Dr. Chen explained to his father that some conditions simply couldn't be fixed. But Isabella had fixed it in 30 seconds. Antonio's breathing grew sharper as anger began mixing with wonder. Each inhale now carried the sound of rage building in his chest. The clock continued its relentless ticking, but now it sounded like a countdown to someone's reckoning. Because if Dr. Chen had missed something this simple, this treatable, then either he was incompetent or he was complicit. In Antonio's world, both options carried the same consequence. But there was something else. A memory that suddenly crashed through his consciousness with devastating clarity. His daughter, Sophia. 10 years ago, she died in his arms after a car accident orchestrated by rivals trying to weaken his empire. She'd been 23, brilliant and beautiful, the one person in his world who'd loved him unconditionally. As she lay dying in that hospital bed, her lips had moved, forming words he couldn't hear, couldn't understand. He'd watched her die in silence, knowing she was trying to tell him something, trying to share her final thoughts with her father. And he'd been helpless, trapped behind the wall of deafness that Dr. Chen had told him was permanent and untreatable. The rage that flooded Antonio's chest now had a sound, the sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth, the grinding of molars as his jaw tightened with fury. Even his silence had been taken from him. Isabella remained by the window, watching Antonio's face cycle through shock, gratitude, suspicion, and finally cold calculation. She'd worked for enough powerful men to recognize the expression settling over his features. Someone was about to pay a very steep price for their deception. Antonio's phone rang, and this time he was prepared for the sound. He answered and heard his lieutenant's voice for the first time, Marcus, his most trusted associate for 20 years. The man sounded exactly as Antonio had imagined, deep, gravelly, carrying the weight of too many cigarettes and too much whiskey. But beneath the familiar report on collections and territorial disputes, Antonio detected something new. A tone he'd never been able to hear before. Concern. Genuine worry about Antonio's well-being that lip-reading had never conveyed. After ending the call, Antonio realized how many conversations he'd misunderstood because he could only see lips, not hear tone. How many enemies he'd failed to detect because he couldn't hear the nervousness in their voices. How many allies he'd misjudged because he'd missed the sincerity in their words. His deafness had been more than a medical condition. It had been a strategic disadvantage that someone had deliberately maintained. And Antonio Marchetti did not tolerate disadvantages any more than he tolerated lies. The appointment with Dr. Chen was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. Antonio spent the remaining hours experiencing his penthouse with newly awakened senses. The home that had been his sanctuary of silence revealed itself as a symphony of subtle sounds. Water moving through pipes behind the walls. The hum of electrical systems powering his security network. The distant murmur of staff members going about their duties. Each sound told a story Antonio had never been able to read before. But as afternoon faded toward evening, Antonio's focus narrowed to a single purpose. Someone had stolen 42 years of his life. Someone had profited from his disability. Someone had looked him in the eye and lied about his condition while his daughter died trying to share her final words. And Antonio Marchetti always collected his debts with interest. Dr. Chen's office occupied the entire top floor of the most expensive medical building in Manhattan. Antonio had been there dozens of times over the years, always leaving with the same verdict: permanent hearing loss, congenital defect, nothing to be done. Tonight felt different as Antonio walked through those familiar hallways. His footsteps echoed off polished floors, with a rhythm he'd never experienced. The elevator hummed with mechanical precision. Even the fluorescent lights buzzed with electrical energy. Dr. Chen's receptionist looked up nervously as Antonio entered. She'd always been skittish around him, but tonight her fear had a soundtrack. The rapid clicking of her pen against the desk, the sharp intake of breath when their eyes met, the subtle rustle of papers as her hands trembled. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen emerged from his private office. The man looked exactly as Antonio remembered. Silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to hide a growing paunch, gold-rimmed glasses reflecting the overhead lighting. But now Antonio could hear the doctor's approach. The confident stride that had always seemed professional suddenly sounded hollow, artificial, like an actor playing a role he'd rehearsed too many times. They walked into the examination room together. Dr. Chen gestured toward the examination chair with practiced authority. Antonio settled into the familiar position while the doctor prepared his instruments, the otoscope clicking as it was assembled, the light buzzing to life with electronic precision. The doctor approached with his usual professional confidence, but Antonio detected something new in his movements, a hesitation that hadn't been there during previous visits, as if Dr. Chen sensed that tonight's examination might reveal more than either of them was prepared to handle. Antonio tilted his head to allow access to his right ear. Dr. Chen positioned the otoscope and peered inside, his breathing steady but slightly faster than normal. Antonio could hear everything now, the doctor's quiet gasp of surprise, the sharp intake of breath that suggested discovery, the moment when professional composure cracked just enough to let truth slip through. Dr. Chen stepped back from the examination chair, his face pale beneath the office lighting. His hands trembled as he set down the otoscope, the instrument clattering against the metal tray with more noise than necessary. For several long moments, silence filled the room. Not the comfortable silence Antonio had known his entire life, but the heavy, oppressive quiet that comes before devastating revelations. When Dr. Chen finally spoke, his voice carried defeat. "The blockage is gone! Completely removed." Antonio's expression remained neutral, but his newly awakened hearing caught every nuance of the doctor's distress, the way his voice cracked slightly on certain words, the increased pace of his breathing as stress flooded his system, the subtle shift in tone that suggested a man desperately trying to control a situation that had spiraled beyond his influence. The questions came next, delivered with the quiet intensity that had made Antonio Marchetti legendary in certain circles. How long had the blockage been visible? When had Dr. Chen first noticed it? Why had removal never been attempted or even suggested? Dr. Chen's answers came slowly, each word carefully chosen, but ultimately inadequate. He claimed the blockage had been difficult to detect, suggested that removal would have been risky, insisted that the hearing loss had appeared to be nerve damage rather than mechanical obstruction. Antonio listened to these explanations with growing certainty that every word was a lie. His newly awakened hearing allowed him to detect the subtle vocal patterns that accompany deception, the slight tremor that crept into the doctor's voice when he stretched the truth, the way his breathing became shallow during the most fabricated portions of his explanation. But it wasn't just the lies Antonio could hear now. It was the fear. Dr. Chen was terrified, and that terror had a very specific quality. This wasn't general nervousness. This was the focused dread of someone whose carefully constructed deception had just collapsed around him. Antonio stood slowly from the examination chair, his movement generating sounds that seemed to echo with menace in the small room. His suit fabric whispered against itself as he straightened his jacket. His shoes clicked against the floor with measured precision. Even his breathing carried an ominous weight that made Dr. Chen step backward toward the wall. The conversation that followed was brief but comprehensive. Antonio's voice remained calm, controlled, almost conversational in tone, but beneath that civilized surface lay the promise of consequences that made the doctor's face drain of all remaining color. Antonio asked about payment records, treatment histories, consultation notes, spanning the past 18 years. Dr. Chen's responses became increasingly desperate as the scope of his deception became clear. The blocked ear canal had been visible during every examination since Antonio was 16 years old. The condition was not only treatable, but easily corrected with basic medical intervention. The continuing diagnosis of permanent hearing loss had been a deliberate misrepresentation maintained for over 2 decades. Antonio absorbed this information with the calculating precision that had built his criminal empire. Someone had paid Dr. Chen to keep him deaf. Someone who benefited from Antonio's disability had been financing his medical deception for most of his adult life. The question was, who? The doctor's confession came in broken segments, interrupted by tears and desperate pleas for mercy. Antonio listened to it all with newly awakened ears, hearing not just the words, but the complete emotional breakdown of a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. And then Dr. Chen said something that made Antonio's blood run cold. "It was your uncle," the doctor whispered, his voice breaking. "Dominic Marchetti. He paid me to keep you deaf. He said it was for your own protection, that you'd be safer if you couldn't hear the violence around you. But I knew. I always knew it was about the inheritance. As long as you were disabled, he controlled the family business. He controlled everything." Antonio's mind reeled. His uncle Dominic, his father's brother, the man who'd helped raise him after his father's death, the man who'd managed the family operations while Antonio learned the business, the man who'd been at Sophia's funeral, holding Antonio's hand while his daughter was lowered into the ground. The man who'd ensured Antonio couldn't hear his daughter's last words. The rage that consumed Antonio in that moment had a sound unlike anything he'd experienced in his newly awakened world. It was the roar of 42 years of stolen life, the scream of a father who'd lost his daughter's final message, the howl of betrayal so deep it threatened to tear him apart from the inside. But Antonio Marchetti didn't scream. He didn't roar. He simply stood, thanked Dr. Chen for his honesty, and walked out of the office with the quiet dignity of a man who'd just been given the most valuable information of his life. As he rode the elevator down to the ground floor, listening to the mechanical hum and feeling the slight vibration through his feet, Antonio made a decision. His uncle Dominic had stolen his hearing to maintain power, had kept him disabled to control the family empire, had condemned him to silence while his daughter died trying to speak her final words. Antonio would make sure Dominic heard everything before the end. He would hear Antonio's voice, strong and clear, explaining exactly why he was dying. He would hear the fear in his own breath as he realized his deception had been discovered. He would hear every second of his own ending, experiencing sound in his final moments the way Antonio had been denied it for 4 decades. But first, Antonio had someone to thank. He returned to his penthouse to find Isabella still there, cleaning the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown all day. She looked up as he entered, her eyes questioning, concerned. Antonio walked to her slowly, his footsteps announcing his approach in ways he was still getting used to. When he reached her, he did something he hadn't done in 42 years. He spoke, and heard his own voice saying the words, "Thank you. You gave me back more than my hearing. You gave me truth. And truth in my world is the most valuable currency there is." Isabella smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Your daughter," she said softly. "She wanted you to know she forgave you. For everything. She loved you, even in the silence." Antonio's breath caught. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I was her nurse," Isabella replied, her voice gentle but steady. "I was there when she died. I watched her lips move, trying to tell you something you couldn't hear. I saw the pain in your eyes, knowing you couldn't understand her final words. I've spent 10 years trying to find you, trying to tell you what she said. And when I saw your ear today, I finally understood why you never heard her." The room seemed to spin around Antonio. This woman, this stranger who'd walked into his life by chance, had been there at the most devastating moment of his existence, had witnessed his greatest loss, had carried his daughter's final message for a decade. "What did she say?" Antonio asked, his newly awakened voice breaking with emotion. Isabella reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. She said, "Tell Papa I love him. Tell him it's not his fault. Tell him to find joy again, to hear the music he's been missing. Tell him I'll be waiting in a world where everyone can hear." Antonio Marchetti, the ghost, the most feared man in New York, the crime boss who'd built an empire on violence and control, collapsed into a chair and wept. And for the first time in his life, he heard the sound of his own grief, and it was beautiful. Sometimes the greatest revelations come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes power built on deception crumbles under the weight of simple truth. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the city discovers that the bravest act is not controlling everything around you, but allowing someone else to help you hear what you've been missing all along. Antonio would deal with his uncle. Justice would be served, debts would be collected, and the empire would be restructured. But first, he would sit in this moment, listening to the sound of his own tears, hearing the voice of compassion from a woman who'd spent 10 years searching for him. Because in the end, it wasn't the power or the fear or the control that mattered. It was the sound of truth, spoken clearly, that changed everything. And Antonio Marchetti finally understood that some silences are meant to be broken, not with violence, but with the simple act of listening to what we've been too deaf to hear.